get started on today's session. We're glad you're here. We know that lots of things are happening, and we're really grateful to have everyone joining Cohort today. We want to make sure that if you want to talk about today's session on social media, you have the information to do so. You can use the hashtag xAPI Cohort. You can tag the xAPI Gnome. And our presenter today is Tim at Watershed, so make sure you're tagging him. All right, just as a reminder, we're on week 10 of 12, and we are progressing right along. I see lots of movement in the teams. I see lots of changing priorities as well, and that's okay. That's where we are. That's what's happening. We're just glad that we're able to still bring together our community and continue to learn together and continue working together. As of last week, we have grown by 11 new members, which is amazing, and a reminder that there might be new folks joining your team, lurking, asking questions, wanting to engage, even in week 10. So just make sure you're making room for those new folks. It's never too late to join Cohort. You're right, Megan. Today we have Tim Dickinson, the Director of Strategy over at Watershed, presenting to us some case studies. And this will wrap up our sprint on case study presentations with that practical knowledge, which was a really cool addition this year. And we're going to do some team check-ins. Behind the mics today, we have myself, Jessica Jackson, and Megan Torrance is with us. And I'll make sure we add her picture next week. We have Erin and Jamie as well. They are our producers. Today is week 10. As I said, we are on our 4th week of case studies with some practical experience from the field. Today, Tim is going to present from Watershed, and then next week we'll move into project team demos. So I have one team sign up. We still have 5 additional slots, and we'll talk about how to do that later today. But just want to remind everyone that your team demo does not need to be perfect. It's just an opportunity to work out loud and show what you're learning and demonstrate the work you've been doing all semester. And then we'll have in May the xAPI party and the download. It's 100% online this year, so everyone can join from all over. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Tim, who's going to present out some case studies from his work at Watershed. So I'm trying. No problem.
Thank you so much, Jess. I'll just give the PowerPoint slides a moment to load, and in the meantime, introduce myself really quickly for anyone I haven't met before. There we go. Hopefully everyone sees that first slide. So my name's Tim Dickinson, and I am the Director of Strategy at Watershed. That is an intentionally vague title because I do a few different things there, and one of those things is focused on education of our clients as well as people who might be excited or interested in using xAPI or an LRS. If you're not familiar with Watershed, I imagine most people here are, because we do try to offer support to the cohort for people who need to use an LRS. But we are a learning record store and learning analytics provider. So that's a bit about me and Watershed. So what I am here to do today is walk you through a case study of one of our clients, actually. So I'm going to be talking about how Caterpillar uses xAPI within their digital learning strategy and their ecosystem and everything that they've done with it, and also walk you through a bit of their kind of process and journey with it as well, because a lot of times we're very guilty of this ourselves. As a technology provider and vendor, we like to present these really beautiful case studies. Is it just me that hears the musical?
Well, this is Megan Torrance. We're gonna. I know how to make it this way. Keep talking. Hold on.
I just thought it would be a nice little
and I've been waiting on my friends. Yes, I'm waiting on this conference call. All alone.
I'll just go ahead and carry on.
And I'm on hold.
So the point that I was making is that, yes, this is a case study that has taken a long time for CAT to get where it is, but I also hope to kind of explain what they went through to get there. So it's kind of a pretty polished thing at the end, but also open to questions and getting a bit deeper into the nitty-gritty of how they actually got to their final state. So what we're going to focus on is Caterpillar's global dealer learning. And that, let's see. I'm going to jump around a bit because that wasn't the slide I was expecting. Give me just a second. My apologies. Here we go. Okay. So this kind of all begins actually a few years ago with Caterpillar and their global dealer learning network. So this project, this example is not internal Caterpillar employees. This is their dealer learning academy. So about 300,000 people across the world, where, you know, just like your car dealers, like you go to buy a Toyota or a Honda, you don't actually go to a Toyota or a Honda shop unless you're lucky enough to be buying a Tesla. You're actually going to a Caterpillar dealer. And they were conducting some research in 2016 and 2017. They began an organizational study that the overarching conclusion from it was that if they were able to standardize the customer experience across their dealer network, Caterpillar could potentially increase their global revenue by $20 billion. So that was billion with a B. And as part of that study, they really identified a correlation between top-performing dealers and underperforming dealers and how they developed their leadership pipelines and their sales and product support workforces. So the idea was that dealers with a mature learning and development organization generated better profits, even during unfavorable economic conditions. And so in that sense, the global dealer learning team looked at how learning and development was being applied across these key roles and identified a big difference in how learning programs were being implemented at each dealer. So they really needed a more efficient way to design and deploy these learning programs to the dealers with the aim of creating a simple standard approach that all of the dealers could follow. So whether you're a massive dealer that has thousands of employees or you're a much smaller dealer that might only have tens or a few dozen employees, the idea is providing them with the same level of resources, the same level of sales and product support and maintenance training, the same level of leadership development, and doing so in a way that was very engaging and responded to, you know, the needs of what they perceived, you know, within Caterpillar to be today's learner. You know, we looked at this slide in particular where we're looking at their shift in content strategy. Caterpillar, you can imagine, I don't know anyone here who's ever tried to fix something in their house or do a self-repair on their car. I don't know about you, but I heavily rely on YouTube for those sorts of things, for that sort of kind of technical repair and maintenance walkthrough. And Caterpillar wanted to essentially recreate that experience as part of their shift in their content strategy as well. So we'll get into some of what that looks like. I'll jump ahead to a bit more of what laid the groundwork for some of that technical and content strategy. So here we're just looking at their 5-step process as they kind of concluded that organizational study that said we need to simplify and streamline our process across our entire global dealer network. What does that actually look like? So they started here with goal setting, setting clear business goals and defining what competencies are required at these dealers to win new business before following up on that and assessing the learners and identifying the gaps. So using assessment tools within that and reporting on that to identify what those gaps are, and then developing custom development plans for dealers and individuals at those dealers, and then having a mechanism to reinforce and apply that learning on demand, on the job with performance support. And then finally measure the performance and validate the competency levels. So they set goals that were clearly aligned to business needs and then agreed upon and defined what competencies were needed to win new business and achieve those goals. And the final stage was measuring and validating whether or not those competencies were met. So this is just a bit of the background for their framework and their development process. but recognizing that this is the xAPI cohort, where the heck does xAPI actually come into that? So as CAT is going through this organizational study several years ago and reassessing how they're going to develop their global dealer network, they started reaching out to potential vendors. And we at Watershed first spoke to them in person, actually as far back as 2016. And their global dealer learning leadership team, one of the first things that they did was they got all of their potential vendors in a room together and essentially kind of told us, if you want to be a part of this, if you want to work with us, this is what you've got to do. And one of those "this is what you've got to do" statements was actually supporting xAPI, because a big part of what CAT wanted to do was use new digital tools to enable that streamlined, simplified experience. That was a similar experience regardless of the size, scope, and capabilities of any given dealer. And they really wanted to carefully look at, if I jump back into this 5-step process, they needed the data to assess learners, they needed the data to assess learners and measure performance. They also needed to use xAPI to reinforce and apply learning so that they had that interoperability across different tools and systems. So really, as far back as 2016, they started pushing on all of their vendors to support xAPI. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about what that looks like. But it's a trend that we've seen across a lot of our clients is if you are a large organization or if you are essentially buying new technology from people, don't be afraid to be a bit aggressive with them and push them around sometimes if you can. Because if they do not already support xAPI, you can use your checkbook as a way to get it onto their roadmap sooner rather than later. We've seen actually another client of ours, his name's Tim Collins from T-Mobile. He presented at our Watershed Summit last year, and he presented on essentially his RFP process to select tools and providers that would only support xAPI, and essentially made demonstrating that part of their RFP process, to where he actually was working with a major LMS provider, was planning to work with a major LMS provider, and they lost the business because they said they would support xAPI, just like all providers and vendors do during the selection process. But because his selection process asked them to prove it, not just say it, other smaller, more agile providers were able to prove it, and so the large provider essentially lost business because of that. So that's just a bit of feedback that we've seen from a lot of our clients, and something Caterpillar did way back at the beginning of this process was they weren't afraid to lean on providers and say, this is what you need to do to support our vision, because our vision is having these tools communicate together, having all of our data in a single format in a single location. And if you're not on board with that, we're not sure that you're going to be able to participate in this. So that's kind of where that originated. Their approach was really focusing on people, processes, and technology. They started with trying to understand the needs of their people better and trying to understand their current business processes better. I'm not going to focus too much on that because that's essentially not my forte, but I do think it's worth noting that both of those were prioritized, or maybe not necessarily more important than technology considerations, but in terms of the order of operations, they came before technology considerations. It was only after they had a really keen understanding of their people's needs and their current internal processes that they began to make technology decisions. So what did all of that look like at the end of the day? So, this is kind of what we're here for, and to dig into a bit more detail. So what we are looking at here is a diagram of Caterpillar's learning ecosystem for their global dealer learning network. We can see here on the bottom left-hand side all of the different training programs that they're using within their learning ecosystem, their digital learning ecosystem. So all of these tools are supporting the learning for their entire sales workforce, their instructor accreditation, service and sales for all of their different product groups. So Caterpillar has marine products, electric products, oil and gas products, and then they're also doing their leadership development programs through this digital learning ecosystem. So, I mentioned, back in 2016, they got all of the providers in a room and essentially said, you're in or out with supporting xAPI. And, that was an opportunity to see who was willing to put in some work. It was actually really exciting. So, Watershed, as kind of the LRS people in the room at the time, Inkling and Kaltura, if you're not familiar with them, I'll spend a brief moment on each one a bit later on, but at the time, neither of them supported xAPI at all. Inkling is kind of an authoring tool and knowledge management system. Kaltura is a video hosting provider. Neither of them supported xAPI, but they both wanted to work with Caterpillar. And so they were willing to work with us at Watershed and essentially say, okay, what exactly do you need from us to be able to validate that we can provide data in this format? How do we need to represent that? And then there's some others that maybe weren't as agile, but are still doing what they can to support the process. So one example is LogicBI, which is kind of a partner and channel management focused LMS, and they don't have native support for xAPI yet, but they've worked with us to give us the data in different formats. So that's just a bit of a thing that happens actually within Watershed. Is LogicBI, as an example, we're converting their data to xAPI for storage in Watershed. So I'll kind of break each of these out and go into a little bit more detail in a few moments. But just as kind of an overview with what CAT is doing. So since they have all of this data stored in their learning record store, it's much easier for them now to report on not a system-by-system basis, but actually look at, for their training programs, how are people progressing through instructor accreditation? How effective is our sales workforce learning? And those sorts of things. So their evaluation and measurement becomes much easier because they're not looking at siloed data across these 5 different tools. And then also from the dealer experience perspective, the dealer experience can be whatever works best for them. They can rely heavily on the LMS if they want. If what they want to do is a lot of instructor-led training, they can do that. If they don't want to do any of that, they can work a lot with the video and other types of tools that they have to support this ecosystem. So I'll kind of dig in a little bit more detail what each of these different pieces look like, because I think it might be helpful to actually just see some examples of what the data itself actually looks like when represented, in the xAPI format for some of these different tools. So if we look at the Dealer Performance Center, this is essentially their LMS, where it's managing their learning plans. They can register for ILT, access e-learning courses. So this was the LogicBI tool in the previous diagram that we saw. So this is still heavily used, and I just wanted to highlight, what does this data actually look like? So I hope that you can see this, because essentially what we're representing is kind of a traditional example of completing a course in an LMS. So this is not the most revolutionary way to actually use xAPI, but nonetheless, it's still critical because this data is very relevant to CAT, and it's needed to have alongside some of the other data from the other systems. So what I wanted to do was actually break down in detail kind of what some of these statements look like, how they're represented. So I mentioned that this data is actually being sent to Watershed not in an xAPI format. It's being sent to Watershed in CSV format, and we've automated a process to convert that data into xAPI statements. That is not ideal, realistically, or I should say it's not ideal, but realistically, when you start looking at complex technology ecosystems, maybe not everything is going to support xAPI. So in this sense, we're converting that data into xAPI format, and you can see where we're able to represent who the individual is who's completed something. So we have our actor, we have our simple verb that is just completed, and what did they do within the LMS. So we can see within LogicBI, this individual completed Chapter 17 or Course 17 of charging system, while still providing some of the relevant SCORM type data that we're all familiar with here of the score, the completion, the duration, etc. So this is kind of that maintaining the status quo example of xAPI. It's still really helpful. It's still needed. It's relevant to Caterpillar to understand what people are doing in their dealer performance center. But some of the other things that I want to touch on are some of the other systems. So I'll look at Channel 1 as an example. That is what Caterpillar internally calls Kaltura. You know, on the second or third slide, I touched on their shift in content strategy. You know, they're trying to simplify and streamline how people learn and educate themselves on servicing their equipment, selling their equipment. And, you know, the example of I use YouTube every time something goes wrong in my car to figure out what a warning light means, or what I'm looking at when I'm looking at my engine with the hood up, how hugely helpful it is to have those video walkthroughs. But for Caterpillar, you know, this is equipment that can literally kill and maim you if you try to maintain it or service it incorrectly. So they actually were really worried about letting people upload content on YouTube that they couldn't not have completely locked down, but at least curate and moderate to ensure that people are doing so in a way that is safe and following best practices. So they're using Channel 1, which is, like I said, what they're calling Kaltura as a video platform. So subject matter experts can still create and share their own video tutorials. Caterpillar can just moderate and monitor them to make sure that they are following best practices. And it also provides some really simple and easy to use in-video editing. You can add things like quizzes and knowledge checks, as well as subtitles and translation to those videos. And it was really great to work with the Kaltura team to help them implement xAPI. I'm not sure how much anyone is familiar with profiles in xAPI. Kaltura actually went a bit off of the video profile when we're looking at how they represent video activity via xAPI. And in some ways, I actually think it's pretty exciting. I'm going to do as much verbal walkthrough as I can because in building this presentation, I realized some of the challenges of showing an xAPI statement that is quite long within a slide. And I apologize that I had to put these in slides, because if I actually showed them to you in the LRS, I wouldn't be able to do things like blur out people's names and identifying information. So I'll walk you through what we are actually seeing here from this xAPI statement from Kaltura. So we have our standard actor-verb-object framework, where we can see that this individual watched the video that is titled Hydraulic Pump Go-to-Market Playbook. Within that, there's some additional information here, such as the result extension. So Kaltura is using, they're kind of doing something unique on their end, which is something in addition to the standard xAPI profile, and it's how they're measuring process, or I should say progress, through videos. So every video is going to have its own unique duration, and basically Kaltura generates 4 statements as people progress through videos. So they're doing a bit of math on their side so that when someone hits the 25% mark in a video's duration, Kaltura generates a statement that has their progress count here at 25. It happens again when they're at 50%, 75%, and 100%. So that way, regardless of the duration of videos, they're trying to provide an easy way for people to understand, you know, are people watching half of it, 3/4 of it, or completing the entire thing at 100%. So I think that's a really interesting way in which they went outside of the bounds of the xAPI profile for videos. One thing that is a challenge if you go beyond the bounds of those profiles, and why the profiles exist in the first place is when that might not align with other video platforms. So if Kaltura used another video platform, or they have an authoring tool in Inkling that can embed video content into their, I hesitate to call what Inkling creates courses. They're almost microsites or interactive PDFs. But you can embed video in there. And if Inkling and Kaltura aren't describing video interactions in the same way, it can become tricky when interpreting that in an LRF. For instance, I've seen this myself. This is a statement from Kaltura that is saying someone watched the video, because we can see here in the result, I'm going to try and just highlight a little bit. If we look up here, we're seeing their result extension, and the progress is 100, and the verb they're using is watched. I have seen other video providers change the verb from watched to completed, as an example, to describe the same event. So they might describe, I watched a video, which means I actually clicked play and it started playing, but when I actually reach the end of that video, do I generate a new statement that says watched or completed? So that's an example of I've seen that discrepancy, and it can be difficult to reconcile that if you're not using the profiles that are provided within xAPI. So that's definitely a benefit of that within xAPI, and there's ways around that. Within Watershed we do verb and activity aliasing. Because as much as we want people to use those profiles and ascribe to that, we can't completely control what people like Kaltura or Inkling or other providers might do when implementing xAPI. So we have the ability to say, if a verb of one that I've seen is searched and searched on as two verbs, we might alias those together and say, within the context of reporting in the LRS, we're going to call searched and searched on the same verb. Or there might be a typo in the course title, and so that then affects our object name. That's another example where if you've got typos or version IDs where we alias on that. But that verb example or the result example are both examples of why it's important to use profiles where available. That said, it was really great to work with a company that was willing to make changes to support xAPI to support what Caterpillar is trying to do. So I'll jump ahead to CAP Learning Marketplace. So here, this is their Open Sesame platform. So this is their course marketplace where they have leadership and management courses, soft skills, safety, etc. And this is kind of similar from the LMS perspective, where this is kind of SCORM parity data. So Open Sesame actually does support xAPI, but because they are reselling courses from different providers, they can only provide as much detail as those providers give them. So they were great to work with in providing xAPI data for the courses from Open Sesame, but this is once again still a bit of a SCORM parity. I'm going to jump ahead to Inkling because I know I've gotten a question about Inkling, and I want to have a moment to share in a bit more detail of what that looks like. So for anyone who's not familiar with Inkling, it's WYSIWYG HTML5 authoring. I kind of think of it as, does anyone remember in the 90s and early 2000s what the tool was called from Microsoft that essentially allowed you to try and turn a Word doc into a web page, and it generally failed kind of spectacularly? Imagine a much better version of that 20 years later, and that's how I like to think of Inkling. It's a really simple drag and drop. What you see is what you get. You create content in HTML5. You can embed it. It is really nice to embed videos. It's really great for performance support and knowledge base articles and document creation. And Caterpillar relies on it heavily. You know, when you can imagine the detailed product manuals that accompany some of the mining equipment and heavy machinery that a company like Caterpillar is producing, it's great to be able to manage that, to make it interesting and compelling, to embed videos and different interactive content within that instead of just dropping a 200-page PDF or a 200-page booklet on someone's desk and saying, this is the product manual. Being able to make it interactive was really important for them and really make it much more engaging. So for Inkling, what we're looking at here is a statement from an interaction where someone has read a page that is part of a hierarchy of content. So we've got our traditional actor and verb. The verb here is read, and we can see that what this individual has read is content on hydraulic oil filters. So that's just kind of our introduction. But then you can see something nice that Inkling's done is, within their documentation, everything is nested, everything is hierarchical. So you have pages that might be a part of a chapter, that might be a part of a course or something larger. And so Caterpillar can really break that down in detail, where we can now see that hydraulic oil filters page that this individual read, within our context activities tag up here, we have our parent, which is introduction. So this was part of the introductory chapter to an overall course. And that course is off-highway truck service training. So it's really helpful to have that content hierarchy within the xAPI statements so that Caterpillar can essentially trace those breadcrumbs up the food chain to understand what people are learning, what people are accessing, how are they behaving within Inkling as a platform, and get that kind of detailed insight into what people are doing there. Let's see. One last thing to kind of touch on is just more of an overall view. So I wanted to walk everyone through kind of specifically how these different tools are representing interactions within them via xAPI and what some of that might look like. But at a higher level for Caterpillar as an organization, having that detailed data in a common format, in a common location, has really helped them in a few different ways. So what we're looking at here are some of the three critical areas where Caterpillar's benefited from using xAPI is understanding their adoption and readiness. So knowing what people's knowledge and skill sets are for their core product areas, as well as their ability to perform some of the critical tasks within those core product areas. And then really understanding the effectiveness of their learning solutions. So having much more detailed insight into video usage and consumption, or knowledge base and kind of on-demand product knowledge support and consumption has been hugely helpful for the CAT team from a learning experience understanding. One thing that they're really excited about recently was anomaly detection within their video platform. So the CAT team is manually looking at for video content, why do particular videos drastically spike in engagement? Is it the subject matter? Is it the way the video was produced? Is there something happening in the environment that is causing this specific thing to be extremely popular right now? And so they really like the ability to see that immediately on demand at a glance as kind of an example of what they've been able to get out of having all of this data in the same place, in the same format. They're also really excited about, this essential 3-year process has, I don't want to say come to a conclusion because it's always ongoing, but they are at a state where they are excited because they have a learning ecosystem with 5 critical applications, all using xAPI to record data and interactions that's happening within them. So their overall results were, at a high level, they were really excited. We're all in this for business reasons, and they were able to actually reduce their costs by 10% by enabling more of the streamlined digital learning via their digital ecosystem, while simultaneously increasing the adoption of all learning across the dealer network by 10%. And a lot of that 10% increase came from a significant increase in digital learning. So as a result of all of their efforts in creating more modern experiences, aggregating the data, and having it all be interoperable, they saw a 50% increase of usage of their digital learning ecosystem tools and technology. So that's something that they were also hugely excited about, and they feel all of this really contributes to that overall, C-level business goal of having a consistent, streamlined customer experience, regardless of size or level of complexity of dealers, helping to ensure that all dealers are getting the same information and the same experiences is hugely critical to that goal, and their global dealer learning team is very confident and excited that they've met that goal as much as they can. All right, I will take a deep breath, see if anyone has any further questions, because I'm happy to answer any additional questions that people have. There was one or two that I was able to get to within the discussion itself, but if there's any others beyond that, happy to answer anything else that anyone might have. Otherwise, I can turn it back over to the Torrance team.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. I think I see a couple questions coming into the chat, so I'll wait a little while.
Sure, I can give it just a moment. Now would have been a good time for the whole team to accidentally start playing.
True.
We can wait for that.
Izzy,
all you have to ask, we can find some horrible technology thing to happen in the middle of an Adobe Connect session.
Yeah.
How did you handle?
All right, but Tim, looks like you do have a question about actor identification.
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question for anyone who's not in the chat. Izzy asked, how did we handle identities across the different applications? That is a very good question, and even a good reminder to me that there's actually a portion of the slide that I failed to touch on. I'm going to cycle back to, I went too far, here. So one thing that we were actually collecting data from as well was their global dealer directory, which essentially has persona information for all of the people, which allowed us to upload that into the LRS. And this is essentially a feature of Watershed that helps with some of that persona management, so that within Watershed we can say, Inkling identifies this unique person as actor 12345 within their xAPI statement. And Kaltura identifies this person by their Caterpillar corporate email, because that's how they access the platform. We're able to essentially align those with data from their global dealer directory to say this person, Tim Dickinson, is both Inkling ID 123 and Tim Dickinson at cat.com, and maybe a third identity as well. So that's a feature of the LRS from Watershed, because it's a really good question, Izzy. That is oftentimes an issue when we start looking at these different ecosystems. Generally, it's most of the time an email address is sufficient, and you can use the email address across different providers. But at an enterprise level, oftentimes, if we're looking at an internal system, it might be an enterprise ID or some unique employee ID, those types of things. So we use the data that Cat was able to provide from their global dealer directory to essentially align all of those personas to individual people. David's question. After a couple of weeks of 20 gigs of data, how do we deal with that? That's a good question as well. So what we at Watershed have is, we call it the data freight train, and we've known that we have been tied to the tracks in front of the data freight train for 3 or 4 years now. So we put a lot of effort on our side into scalability, both from a data aggregation side. So when we're looking at xAPI statement pipes from different LRSs, ensuring that we can ingest a lot of data at different times. And then also from a reporting side, putting a lot of effort into ensuring that our reports are responsive within reasonable load times when we're looking at clients that have tens and hundreds of millions of statements in their LRS and things like that. I will struggle to answer your question in detail, David, without getting myself in trouble, just because how we handle a lot of that scalability, those scalability issues, is something that we kind of consider proprietary information. Because your question's a very real one, it is definitely a challenge and is important. I'm trying to think of a way to say that to actually provide some benefit to you without just saying we know it's a problem and we deal with it. We use, we're hosted on AWS, and we use a variety of their advanced services to enable some of that scalability. I will apologize if that's probably about as detailed as I can get with that response. For your follow-up question, in terms of GDPR and identities, so like I said, we do host on AWS, so we do have capabilities to host data in different AWS regions. So we have some clients who are hosted in the US, we have other clients that are hosted in the EU on different AWS physical facilities. And even within that, we can provide essentially different views into data for different people. So, if I use Caterpillar as an example, and we have their global dealer directory, so we understand that when dealer A accesses Watershed, their leadership team only sees data that dealer A has permission to see, and we can apply that to different geographic regions as well. So, for instance, if someone in Germany wants to access information about dealers, they're not going to actually see personally identifiable information based upon particular agreements with works councils, and that's more of a hypothetical answer. That's not specifically how CAT is handling it right now, but that capability exists as part of how we handle personas and what people can see within the LRS itself. Certain regions might not see personally identifiable information, other regions can. Also, participating in things like Privacy Shield, where we have an agreement between the U.S. Federal Trade Commission and the EU to transmit data between the European Union and the United States. There's a lot of features in terms of data permissions and availability and security that all kind of roll up within greater GDPR compliance. And kind of looking at Megan's question, let me just take a moment to read it. So how much of David's question about data volume is specific to xAPI, and how much is just data volume in general now that we have the ability to store so much more than we could before? That's a good question, because I think I'm going to interpret Megan's question as a bit of a leading one and say that it's not so much an xAPI issue so much as it is a data issue. xAPI gives us more access to data, which is a good thing, and there's kind of a natural progression of data volume and limitations then naturally kind of being a downstream challenge of that. So I don't know that it's necessarily an xAPI issue so much as it's just kind of the current incarnation of the general data growth issue kind of enabled and caused by xAPI in this specific environment. Is that what you were getting at, Megan? Is there anything that you think is worth adding there, or I can kind of let's see if David has anything additional to add to it.
I think that
glad I
we
help.
got through some of your questions, most of the questions, and we're about time to start talking about some cohort business. So thank you so much, Tim, for your presentation and for spending some time walking through that and talking through with folks. This was great.
You are very welcome, and I appreciate the questions and everyone's attention. I was really happy to be here.
So we're going to talk through where your team should be now, and what Alrighty, so we're, like we talked about, we're in weeks 9 through 12. We're in week 10 today, not weeks 9 through 12. But this is where you're taking some next steps, figuring out what's in it for you, how you want to continue on. Maybe you want to continue on with your projects in the next semester, really applying what you're learning and getting to a place where you're able to demonstrate that out to the full team. So we did discuss a little bit. Next week we will be starting project demos, and this will be an opportunity for you to really showcase what you've learned and talk through some of the challenges you're facing or where you might need some support. So next week we start project team demos. We have 2 weeks of project team demos. You can reserve your slot either on April 9th or April 16th. We have had one team reserve a spot on April 16th, and that is Team Makey Makey. So we do have 3 slots for next week. I'll be doing some additional outreach to teams this week to see if anyone's interested in taking those slots. Your presentations are all online right here in Adobe Connect, and we will be spending 20 minutes per team. So that gives each team about 12 to 15 minutes plus some time for questions. Usually teams do use some slides for their presentations. We've also had teams that have shared their screens and kind of walked through some of their projects and do a live demo. And I really want to let you know that it does not have to be perfect or completely finished to share out. It's an opportunity to get feedback on where you are, to show folks what you've accomplished, and to demonstrate what you've learned. That said, I'm going to switch over to our GitHub pages so we can walk through our team updates for this week. And I just had a team sign up for the 16th, so awesome. I'm sharing my GitHub page. So we'll start with Team Adaptive Learning. And I just had another team sign up. Thanks, Jason. Team Adaptive Learning, if anyone is on the line to give an update, Brady or anyone, I'll wait a few seconds for Brady or anyone from Team Adaptive Learning to give their update. Alrighty. Team Alexa. Izzy, are you on the line to share your update? I think I saw Izzy.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, great. So I met with Helena yesterday. We were able to, I was actually able to finally get some integration blocks into our voice flow platform skill. And we did see some statements getting sent to the LRF. Don't need any support right now. Mainly, I'll just be adding in some more integration blocks. And Helena was going to test adding some filler music to give people a little bit of time to think of a response. That's pretty much it.
So thank you, Izzy. Team Audio Video, is anyone on the line to give an update there? Jeremy? Alrighty, Joanne has let me know that this week has been really rough for Team ECE, and they did not have a chance to make much progress, but will be moving full force ahead in the next couple weeks. Team Makey. Brian, are you on the line to share your?
I am. Are you? Okay, good. So I put the URL in the chat. I'm sorry, in the main Slack channel. Accomplishments for the week include Joanne publishing a link in our Slack channel that provides an overview to editing xAPI statements from our JavaScript library. Doug published JSON files for review by the team that incorporate context to our statements. I was able to make improvements to the stage 3 deliverable, which is our learning record provider we're building in live code. We reviewed, in a live session, we reviewed that LRP and declared that version 2-14 of the stage 3 deliverable is acknowledgeable as MVP, or minimum viable product, which is what we were aiming for. We are continuing with a stretch goal to add in that JSON that Doug has built, as adding in context to the statements that we're providing. We also have a known limitation on the current version of the software is connecting to a web server that is hosted locally on my machine for presentation. So we're looking to incorporate the HTML, CSS, and both Crypto.js and xAPI wrapper JavaScript libraries into the app to remove that limitation and allow remote use. That would allow testing by other members of the cohort. So I was also able to record and publish the Team Makey State of the Project video. This sort of shows the view of the project within that MVP that I mentioned. So again, I just posted that URL to the main Slack channel. Let me see what else I want to see here. So the demo includes details of Joanne's xAPI wrapper files, running the web server and the xAPI wrapper JavaScript library, sending statements from HTML in the Chrome browser, the alpha, which is a ping pong ball based response board, and the beta, which is an arcade box based response board. Both of those are using the Makey board. And then we're also looking at viewing statements within the SCORM Cloud xAPI Learning Record Store. Areas where we may need support. Again, we're approaching those stage 3 deliverables as an alpha. It's not really something that can be tested at this point because it's dependent on setting up a web server on the same machine that the software runs. So that's more of a future state. And what we hope to accomplish next week is review and incorporate Doug's JSON modifications to add those context statements. And as I mentioned, embedding HTML, CSS, and JavaScript libraries within the live code project for publication of standalone applications that will work remotely. Any questions or comments?
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Team Pebble. Is anyone on the line to give the update for Team Pebble? So their update, they continued playing with the new InDesign plugin. They're going to work on having a very basic outline of an ebook this week and not needing any support. Team podcast, they're on pause, and their team lead is actually asking for folks to step in and support. So if anyone can or is interested in contributing to Team Podcast, go ahead over to their Slack channel and hop right in. Team SharePoint will no longer meet. Smart Builder, is anyone on the line to give an update for Team Smart Builder to LRS? Anne or anyone? Okay. They were able to revisit and improve the xAPI code in Smart Builder to send more context information. They've been able to enhance their dashboards to use that data and better label their visualizations, and they're going to draw the line and start preparing for their presentation. They need help with if anyone has experience sending xAPI data from Smart Builder, they'd love to see examples to compare to their own effort. And then the final team, Unity 3D, is anyone on the line to give that update? I think I see Jason and Izzy having a conversation about Team Smart Builder. All right, so I'm going to hop back into our Adobe Connect. And just want to remind folks of a few things before we close out this week's web session. So we have our next web session next week here at 2 o'clock, the same place. On May 7th, we have our xAPI party. You can sign up. It is 100% online this year, so anyone can participate. Where to sign up is right there on the screen. And then if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to email me or message me in Slack. Finally, and if you are interested, if your team is interested in signing up for the xAPI party, feel free to message me in Slack to confirm your participation there. We still have one more presentation slot on 4/16 and 2 on 4/9 for project team demo. So if you're interested in demoing next week or the following, make sure you Slack me about that as well. With that, continue to stay safe, and we'll look forward to